the 0 Hour. This is your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining me once again is Professor Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is not only a professor of economics and a professor of economics emeritus, he is also the host of Economic Update, which airs Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV, and he is kind enough to visit us on a regular basis to talk about what I would call alternate models of economic thought and action. So first of all, without any further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. I'm glad to be here.
Secondly, there's no way you and I can have a conversation at this moment without talking about the second quarter results, economic results from the United States. If effing shit show was I'm now Troy's going to have to censor me, was an economic term, I imagine we would apply it to the second quarter. In any case, it seems the doomsayers, I don't know how to put this exactly, but the doomsayers may have more accuracy than some of the more optimistic folks among us might have thought. But that's my initial reaction. What's yours?
Well, I think it is, I hope, a shock, a wake-up call, an antidote to what strikes me over the last 3 months, 4 months, as a level of denial that is astonishing. I mean, for me, what has gone through my mind, particularly the last couple of weeks, is that this must have been what it was like in the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the British Empire, that it's not just that things are falling apart, but it's that the people in the middle of it insist to one another that everything's okay. I mean, we have had from the top, Mr. Trump on down, we're going to go back to work, we're going to go back to school, we're going to go back to life as normal. We're going to have an election in which the two leading candidates explain to us how each of them is the better choice to get us back to normal. And my brain goes, are you crazy? Normal is how we got here. The last thing on earth you ought to want is to get back to where we were before the pandemic hit. The pandemic didn't do this kind of damage in most other countries of the world, the exceptions being countries alarmingly like the United States, Britain, Brazil, and so on. This is, I hope, the kind of shock, dropping 9.5% in 3 months is stupefying. We've not had anything like that since the Great Depression. And even then, things did not go this fast, this far down as what we have now. Since we spent most of the 20th century trying to cope, first with the collapse of the 1930s, then with the fact that we had 2 world wars, one before the Depression and one immediately after. And then we spent the rest of this century with the conservative business community undoing the New Deal, the coalition that created the New Deal, the policies and programs and attitudes that were the New Deal. The whole century was focused on that charismatic event, that climactic event, that catastrophic event. And this one is worse, which means we're looking at a century of coping with the consequences of something even worse. In the Great Depression, we didn't have a pandemic too. We had a terrible collapse the way we have now. But this one is even worse. The economy is even more internationally linked. Look at the United States. You get through the coronavirus catastrophe in one state, it moves to another. You get it under control in the other state, it moves back to the first one or to a third one. How long is this going to go on? How many more viruses are coming down the pike? How much is global warming producing this very sequence? And all of these unanswered and at this point unanswerable questions crowd into my brain and force me to ask you and your audience this question. Are we prepared now, finally, to stop denying how fundamental capitalism has collapsed in our time? And therefore, what kinds of basic questions ought to be asked if we have any hope of climbing out of the hole this system has dug for us? That's, for me, what comes out of today's announcement.
Obviously, that's a critical question. My answer to it is that, personally, is that people don't really think about what capitalism is. People could debate the meaning of it, but to me, capitalism, people say, well, I don't mind if Uncle Joe has his grocery store on the corner. There was one on the corner where I grew up in the Rust Belt, and a nice old guy ran it, younger than me now probably, but ran it. I'm not against that stuff. That's not, in my view, what capitalism is. It ends with ISM. It's an ideology. And it's an ideology that says the way to run a society is by allowing the forces of wealth and the types of people that are driven to accumulate wealth to govern everything we do as a government, as an economy, as a society. I would say the lesson should be that capitalism is a depraved ideology, that it's an ideology that says, I don't give a damn what happens to anybody but me and maybe the people around me. And therefore, I will pursue my self-interest no matter whom it hurts. And we're seeing the results of it now, where it's hurting everybody, including the people pursuing their own self-interest. I sorrow at the death of every individual, but Herman Cain, the Republican politician who was an advocate of this, strong advocate of this point of view, went to a Trump rally and just died of COVID. So really, I would say, is an ideology that hurts virtually everyone. And my fervent hope would be that we learn from this lesson, this horror, how to develop a new mode of thinking that has us truly care for one another. That's my answer.
I feel very similar. I might put it slightly differently. For me, capitalism, I'm an economist, so I look at it through that lens a little bit. For me, the capitalist system is one that asked us to accept an arrangement. And when that arrangement worked out okay, not great, but okay for most people, they were willing, as you put it, to look the other way if it occasionally broke down, to look the other way if it was unfair in particular ways. Anyway, that system was what I call the profit system. And the way it works is this. You get a job. You, the vast majority of people who work for a living, you get a job if and to the extent that somebody else, a capitalist, sees a profit in doing something. If there's a profit in raising apples, if there's a problem in making software, a possibility of profit in making software, whatever it is, the people who have the money or can get access to the money and who see the possibility of profit will then rent the space, buy the machines, and hire the people who then depend on that job for their lives. The majority of people, the vast majority, are employees, and a very small minority are employers. And we live in a society in which the income, the job, the survival, the quality of life of the majority employees is in the hands of a minority, the employers, and we will do well when they do what's profitable, and we won't do well when they do what isn't profitable or avoid doing it. Let me give you just 2 or 3 examples that should be in everyone's mind. Business wanted to quote unquote reopen the economy. Why? Because that's where their profits come from. They want workers to come back to work because they understand, even if the workers don't, that it's the workers that produce the profit that the capitalist gets. You can have the nicest office, the nicest store, the best machines, the best raw material. If you don't have the worker, they don't produce profit for you, all those other things. It's the worker. So they said, come back. And the workers, desperate because they had no income, because they weren't employed, went back. And then they got sick. And then the economy collapsed again, as in Florida, Arizona, Texas, Southern California, and now spreading again to the Midwest. And who knows, perhaps coming back east again. It's capitalists now that are deciding, it isn't profitable for me to do something, so I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to reopen my business. Maybe never. There's a good statistic out there that says over 40% of the businesses that closed over the last 3 or 4 months will never reopen. But I have an even more scary statistic for you. If the majority of businesses do reopen, I can tell you now, they will have much bigger debts than they had before. They will have made big losses on the time they have been out of commission. And so they're going to be looking, here we go, to make up those profits they didn't get. And the way they're going to do that is to change the job you are returning to. Pay less, fewer benefits, longer hours, faster work. The people who are getting jobs are going to discover how much they will have lost. And the people who don't have a job will, of course, have an even greater problem. Why do I say this? Well, this system, we all, the majority, allowed everything that we need and want to depend on the profit-driven decisions of a minority. And that's how we got here. It worked for a while. We all acceded to it. We all assumed it was normal, it was natural, it was routine, it was just the way it was. Yeah, but now we can't anymore. We can't because this system really could not prepare for or manage this virus. And this system could not prepare for and manage this economic downturn. And it sure as heck cannot handle the two together. So we now have to ask big questions. And here's the biggest one for me. Maybe we ought not to have an economic system in which the income and the jobs and the quality of life of a vast majority depends on the profit-driven decisions of a minority. Maybe capitalism is over, and that we're now going to have to find our way to a system that says the profits of a few, the employer, is simply not important enough to hold hostage the life situation of the vast majority. We're going to have to put people to work because they need to work. And we're going to have to give people income because that's what a reasonable society does for people. Give them the income that they need to be decent to one another, to raise their children, to be members of a living community. All of that has to come first. If it can make a profit, fine. And if it can't, fine. That's not, quote unquote, anymore the bottom line. I'm not saying that's the answer, although I happen to think it is. I'm saying we have to ask that level of question, that profound a questioning, because we're in a very profound collapse of a system. And if we don't, then we'll be back in that denial that got us here?
Well, and again, we're talking with Professor Richard Wolff, host of Economic Update. The only thing I would add to what you just said is maybe a little bit more about what I consider capitalism. To me, is not just an ideology; it's now clearly a myth. It's a mythology that says, and some of us thought we learned this after the 2008 financial crisis. I remember writing, the free market God is angry with his followers, clearly because he's punishing them. Of course, government came to the rescue. I don't see how any self-respecting individual of any political party can say going forward, capitalism is a system that works. If it works, why did the government just have to pledge $6 trillion minimum to keep it barely functional at the cost of 150,000 lives so far and 31 million lost jobs? I mean, we could go down all the numbers. The point is, I think anyone who argues that it is a defensible ideology or model for running an economy, it is now so obligated to delude themselves that I'm not sure where we have a conversation exactly. I guess where that leads, at least me to, is okay, but we do need to have a conversation, obviously, as a nation. How do we go about making the argument that this model doesn't work and that we need a much more radical, from the origin of that word, getting to the root of the problem, radical solutions if we're going to stop, killing each other with this disease and building a durable society?
Well, my sad response is that, at least as I see it, events in the real world take a long time to percolate through the fogs and mists and deep personal commitments to ideology. So, for example, I fully expect my libertarian friends and colleagues to start spinning wonderful stories about all of these failures: the failure in the pandemic, the failure of capitalism, the failure of private enterprise to be ready to have a defense, to have resources, to have reserve. All of those failures are the government's fault. That if only they had freed private enterprise from regulations and limits, and interference from the government, none of these bad things would have happened in our economy. And therefore, the solution, even now, is more deregulation, more of a withdrawal by the government. I mean, they will have a problem because at this point, virtually every major industry is dependent on the government. Let me perhaps drive that home. Millions of Americans living on unemployment, we all know, are living on a direct handout from the government. What is less well known, because the corporations try to hide it, is that the overwhelming bulk of our corporations are likewise living on a governmental handout. It comes from a different agency. It's not the unemployment office on the corner. It's the Federal Reserve that is making trillions of dollars available in loans to banks and now all kinds of other corporations. It's so desperate, our situation, that the Federal Reserve is buying corporate bonds directly and indirectly in the market. In other words, it becomes the lender of last resort to the capitalists. And since interest rates are at historic lows, what you basically have is a situation in which every corporation in America, facing whatever problems it has, no customers, no workers, inability to use a technology, making the wrong product, whatever its problems, the easiest, quickest, and cheapest solution is to go to the Federal Reserve, borrow unlimited amounts of new money at an interest rate barely above zero. And so what do we have? A corporate sector indebted beyond anything American business has ever seen before, with the creditor, the only real creditor in the end, being the government. So it's not just the working class that has a disproportionate dependence on the government. It's the business class too. The whole notion that we live in a quote unquote private capitalism, that's not correct anymore. That has to sink in what that means. And if it's the government, which is supposed to represent the majority, and if the majority are employees, not the minority that's business, well, then the government has to come up with a sustained way of providing jobs and incomes and goods and services without going through the bizarre route of letting all of that sit in the hands of a small minority, not accountable to all of us, who's driven by profit and thinks, in the words of Milton Friedman, that the pursuit of private profit by a business is all that that business should be interested in doing. That's how we got here. They're interested in making money, and the rest of it somebody else will take care of. We've now found out they won't. So we got to change the system, or else really the level of denial is even worse than it has struck me as being up to this point.
Well, now I'm not an economist, Richard Wolff, but it seems to me in one respect, at least, it's even worse than what you just described, in that the Federal Reserve's intervention benefits companies that are large enough to, let's say, issue bonds or whatever. So,
Right.
So it not only does everything you just said, but it is government intervention to wind up with a more centralized, monopolized, big corporation-driven society than even we had before, meaning that corporations and their executives will have even more power over our daily lives and will have even less ability to do anything about it thanks to the actions of our own government. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. You will see, you're already seeing what we call in economics the centralization and the concentration of enterprise. And what we mean is centralization, many become fewer, and concentration, the flip side of it, the few that remain are much larger than they were before because basically they've absorbed those that can't survive. It is what happens traditionally in capitalism, only it's happening hothouse fashion. Instead of a slow struggle in which competing enterprises, the winner basically buys out the loser and thereby absorbs them. This happens in all capitalism throughout its history. Now you're seeing it in the moment of a catastrophe. It happens much faster. The big corporations are not only borrowing more easily than the middle ones, but the big corporations, by being able to borrow huge amounts of money at virtually no interest, are in an even stronger position to defeat those medium and small businesses competitively and to be able to merge with them, to buy them out with the money that they've borrowed at virtually no interest. So you're seeing it everywhere, just like you're going to see, and this is what ought to scare the American people. You're going to see businesses, in part because they can borrow money so cheaply, and in part because there are so many unemployed people desperate for work, that they're going to go to the 2/3 of us that are still working and say to us, you've got to accept lower wages, fewer benefits, longer hours, worse living conditions, worse working conditions. But if you don't want to, be my guest, leave. I have millions of unemployed people who will jump at the chance for a job, even if it's under these reduced conditions and pay scales, etc. And the working class is now going to be assaulted economically. That has to be understood. That's part of the same breakdown of the system. If you don't change this system, the centralization and concentration of business, the formal way of saying goodbye to small and medium businesses, plus the immiseration, a famous word, of our working class, becoming more miserable, in case it's not clear, those are built in mechanisms. The way to understand it is this: capitalism puts some people in a very good position and an awful lot of people in a not so good position. And when things break down, the people in a good position who have resources, who own capital, they're going to use it in every way they know how to get through this difficulty in the best possible condition. And the less you have, the fewer your resources to get through. And the people at the top trying to get through are not going to politely avoid costing you as they struggle to survive. We are in a every person for yourself situation. And that means the working class is going to be assaulted, targeted. That's when the wages come down, it'll be because the prices that the profits that the employers want to be able to get have to go up. They're desperate. Their survival as an enterprise, they will tell us, is at stake. So we just kind of have to take it on the chin. If you don't change the system, that's the logic of how this system has always worked. And now it's going to be working that way during a pandemic with an economic collapse of historical, unprecedented depth. It is becoming, if it hasn't been understood yet, a very urgent economic collapse where the questions of basic change are no longer the province of intellectuals in a university having a debate. I mean, that goes on and that has its place. But these issues are now becoming literally bread and butter, daily matters that are going to shape this country. And I hope we will be conscious and able to talk about how to get out of it rather than simply acting out the roles of the capitalist system. Because if we do that, then this system is going to take us down with it.
Well, I want to go out on an optimistic thought anyway, if not note. And that is this: I keep waiting for the catalytic moment, which I think is hard to predict in history exactly when that moment comes. But the moment when millions of working people just say, we've had enough. And whether they march on Washington, march on their state capitals, march on corporate headquarters, whatever they do, that moment when, it may sound impossible to a lot of people, but there have been moments in history where it's happened before. We were able to unionize to a large extent, late 19th, early 20th century. So I keep waiting for the spark to be lit and the change to come. To me, it looks, when I imagine it, it looks like a general strike or something like that. But whatever the form, I don't know. Do you have the same or similar thoughts? And if so, how do you picture it? Just so we can go out envisioning something.
I have the same hopes, and I also have the same thoughts. And I think I see signs. That's all. No guarantees. I'm not predicting anything. But I see signs of people beginning to question some of the basic aspects of American life over the last century and saying, these don't work anymore. These are not acceptable. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples that just in the last week, of the kinds of signs that have spoken to me. In Seattle, Washington, a group of public employees and private employees sick and tired of being told they can't have the wage raise that they need, keeping that city going, marched on the people who make those decisions, the tiny group at the top, as usual, partly private, partly public. And they were so successful. They brought together the Black Lives Matter people, they brought together trade unionists, they brought together concerned citizens, people aggravated and agitated in just the way we've been talking about. They marched, and suddenly, in a matter of 2 hours, the increases that they had been told couldn't be afforded were not only afforded, they were passed, done. So I find that remarkable. That kind of coalition, that kind of getting together, that kind of overwhelming popular support. I see it also in Portland. Whatever the complicated realities on the ground, and I'm not there and I'm no expert, but I'm struck that the governor and the mayor and all kinds of people, teachers, doctors, activists, sure, protesters, but they all got together and they told the president of the United States, take your secret police out of here. And despite all the effort, despite portraying everybody as a looter, despite making it all the usual old law and order junk, it didn't really work for the president this time. Just like trying to have his presidential convention with a large number of people gathered in one place, it eventually didn't work. Despite it all, even among his most fervent supporters, it couldn't be brought off. And then the last one, by no means the least important, but the last one. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, on the floor of the House, explaining to her colleagues that being treated to a gender-specific cursing out by a legislator who disagreed with her, presumably on something, was an unacceptable insult and assault on women, an attempt to reaffirm that women are somehow second class, unserious, able to be dismissed by references to their anatomy or something else, and saying, that's out. You're not going to do that anymore. And if you do it, I'm going to call you out and you're going to be exposed. And telling people that you have a wife and daughters isn't an excuse and isn't an apology. It isn't, except the world has to change. That kind of ordering of society with male at the top and female subordinate, that's out. That's unacceptable. That's what got us into this mess, and that's part of what has to change. I see these things as very powerful signs that there is slowly, and boy, do I wish it were faster, but there is slowly developing a consciousness, which I hope today's statistics underscore, that we are in big trouble. We need a big social change, and that requires us to do what Americans like to call thinking outside of the convention, outside the box.
And parenthetically, as we close, I also loved Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's comment to the effect that I've thrown guys like this out of bars lots of times. It was she was sticking up for the working class too, and I appreciated that. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. But Richard Wolff, economist, author, and host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, as always, even under these grim circumstances, a pleasure talking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure too, and thank you for keeping up this program and making the airwaves have these kinds of conversations.
Thank you. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.